Energy, I think, is just right for playing into those inherent fears and emotions that we have that kind of define all sorts of political discussions.
When we're talking about things that, at least in theory, are rooted in science and engineering and math, it is important to have these conversations that are rooted in those things.
The clickbait economy, where kind of being more shocking is what people want to drive clicks. So all of a sudden, that's driving people further apart.
So you found that 60% of coal capacity shuttered since 2023 came actually from red states, which might not be what people expect.
It is true that those red states built more coal initially, so there's more to close. And some of the more blue-leaning states perhaps closed them earlier to switch to gas.
We want a reliable, affordable, I would add clean in there as well, clean grid of the future.
The modern utility sector, as it's getting more distributed, more intelligent, more online, there's an interesting positive mix of that. Let's be cautious, let's be slow to move because we want to make sure what we're doing is correct.
Hey everyone, and welcome to Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and today we are getting political. And before my mom and dad, surely listening to this episode, frantically call me to remind me I don't have to share every one of my political beliefs in public, we're not getting political in the way you might think. Today we are exploring the why behind the red versus blue mentality of the modern energy industry. In a world where it feels like everything can be political, energy remains a flashpoint that really stands out. Just about everything from permitting to CEO pay to, of course, renewables has been politicized in the power sector. But why? And what might that jumping to political conclusions get wrong? What if it's actually not political at all in energy? That's what we're talking about today, inspired by a stellar piece Energy Central community manager Matt Chester wrote recently, debunking 7 myths behind the politicization of energy. We will link that in the description of this episode. Highly recommend that everybody give it a read. But we're excited to chat about it today and hear a little bit more about the process from the man, the myth, the legend, Matt himself. Matt, how's it going?
It's going great. Thanks, Kinsey. I'm excited to be on this side of the microphone, whereas usually I'm listening on the other side of the podcast. So it's fun to be here.
Yeah, I mean, what people might not know is that Matt is our sort of ad hoc producer for just about everything that we make on Power Perspective. So any good episode that has existed in the annals of history here on our channel, on our feed, Matt has been there for. So now we have him in the hot seat. We're going to talk about this piece. As I said, link it in the episode description. But Matt, I would love if you could start by just summing it up a bit for the listeners. Give me the high level of what this piece was about, and maybe some of the big picture takeaways.
As in my typical role at Energy Central as community manager, that means I'm seeing the content that's coming in. I'm watching the comments and the debates, and whether it's on Energy Central or on LinkedIn or anywhere, you so quickly see those conversations turn into people putting on partisan lenses to say, this is why that decision was made. It's because of the left leaning, the right leaning, and it just felt like too quick of a shorthand that often, when you dig into the data, I would find like, well, it's not that simple. So my goal here was let me kind of cherry pick some arguments and see, are there some examples where maybe your first knee-jerk reaction of what a red versus blue state might look like in energy doesn't come into be as a way to say, well, are those partisan lenses too short-sighted? So, I didn't want to go, it wasn't about going through every misconception and proving every point wrong, but just kind of picking a few out, hopefully getting some people to think about it and realize that in the end, politics, it's a shorthand. It's useful for a lot of things to figure out what different candidates or organizations might tend to push, but we shouldn't be using it as a crutch for all arguments and say, argument closed, that's right wing, that's left wing. And that was the idea of the piece, is just, look at some of the data and pick out nuggets that might seem surprising to the conventional wisdom.
Yeah, I loved this framing. I think it is important for us to interrogate a lot of the assumptions that we make in any part of our lives, our work, or anything. But certainly in the energy industry, this feels really important. And I think it's also important in this moment in time because as we mentioned before, it feels like everything is political, and it feels like the end of the conversation is simply this is what one side agrees and this is what the thinks and this is what the other side thinks, and there's never going to be any common ground within that space, maybe except for nuclear, because everybody is just so entrenched in this is just the way that it is. And so to flip that on its head and say, well, maybe this is actually the way that it isn't, I think was a really interesting framing. And to the point of this sort of moment in time, you started the piece by calling a lot of this, red versus blue kind of back and forth exhausting. I'm sure a lot of people listening to this episode have felt the same way. Maybe they don't put it on Substack and say it out loud, but I'm sure they have agreed in some way, shape, or form. Tell me a little bit more about why it feels exhausting.
Yeah, and you said it well that it's not just an energy. It kind of feels like in so many parts of life, everything is overly politicized, and you know, there are times where I think we all wish we could go back to not knowing every single political belief of our neighbors, the celebrities, whoever it might be. It's just like, we yeah, it might have been a simpler time. So that part's exhausting. But then again, from a more call it academic standpoint, it's exhausting because I think too often it creates a false narrative that people feel inclined to cling to. You talk about identity politics where somebody says, I believe in what this party believes, and so if they said X, I believe X. That's not really doing your due diligence. And you see too often again in the online discourse, it seems to create a situation where people start with a conclusion and then they say, well, let me find the data to back that up. And that's obviously an antithetical to the scientific method or whatever you want to call it. That's not how we should be guiding our research and our decisions. And so I think just seeing that in everything, including a lot of these energy discussions, that's why I say it's exhausting.
I totally agree, and I think especially in the energy sphere, when we're talking about things that at least in theory are rooted in science and engineering and math and economics and physics, it is important to have these conversations that are rooted in those things and not just, what the TV or TikTok or our social feeds tell us to think. I think a lot of it probably has gotten worse in recent years. I'm curious if you feel, similarly, and if so, maybe why this has reached such a fever pitch, a boiling point over the last couple of years. It feels like we're operating at a different sort of baseline level than we were 5, 10 years ago, and I would love to hear why you think that is.
Yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I would agree with that. It seems to have gotten more intense and more entrenched. And I think if you were to pull in somebody who's more well trained in the political arts or the media landscape, it seems that they would probably be pointing to social media's role in a lot of it, where not only, like I said, is there an inclination where you can start with a conclusion and then almost the good and the bad of the internet, you could find any information that you want to twist into backing up that conclusion. So that's a little challenging. And then the social media or even just the clickbait economy, where kind of being more shocking is what people want to drive clicks. So all of a sudden that's driving people further apart. And who knows, maybe with the AI LLMs, this is only going to get worse because people can just say, hey, Claude, tell me why this conclusion is correct. And we've all seen it where those tools will just say, you're absolutely right, and here's why. So it's a little scary to think maybe this is, this kind of fracturing is going to get worse. So zooming into the energy level of the energy perspective of it, I don't know, maybe part of it is because if you look to the side that's, really focusing on sustainability and climate change, that feels and is defined as kind of an existential threat. So you're like, well, I'm going to throw all my weight into that. And then, if you get the side that's, hey, we're wasting billions, trillions of dollars on these this type of infrastructure that we don't need, that maybe isn't as existential, but that kind of really gets to their core. So it's, energy, I think is just right for playing into those inherent fears and emotions that we have that kind of define all sorts of political discussions.
I'm curious how you maybe have seen this play out in your work as the community manager at Energy Central. What are you seeing on the platform itself, and has that served perhaps as any inspiration for writing this piece?
Yeah, and I mean, I'd start in earnestly saying that I think the conversation on Energy Central definitely is a level up on some of the wider social media landscape. So we'll definitely see people with a little bit more of an edge who want to dismiss things because it doesn't align with their beliefs. And as community manager, I always try to take the approach of asking the questions and providing sources I see that might be highlighting another side of things to create that productive discussion. But it's I don't think anywhere online is immune to having people with really strong, really big takes, and sometimes if those get so entrenched, you really don't want to hear the other side. You don't want to open yourself up and say, okay, that makes sense. Maybe I should look more into that. So yeah, that definitely did inspire writing this piece with an idea that, again, I wasn't trying to say I'm gonna, solve or I'm gonna correct for all these misconceptions, but if it's almost just a cheeky little thing I can point to and say, hey, maybe everything isn't so red and blue. Maybe there's a lot more nuance, and those are the conversations that I want our community members to be having, and largely that they are having.
Yeah, and I think it illustrates too the importance of allowing ourselves to still learn things and be surprised by things and to find out more information and to seek out more information and change our minds or to understand that it is at least possible to do just that, which is a good segue to get into some of the big points, the big findings in the piece. As you mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the framing for these different sort of myths within the piece that you wrote was about debunking some of the assumptions that we might make about energy. So I want to talk about some of them that I think really jumped off the page to me. One was about coal. So you found that 60% of coal capacity shuttered since 2023 came actually from red states, which might not be what people expect. So how do you think that data, that finding, that reality might land specifically for utility leaders who are thinking, I'm sure, a lot about coal retirements or pushing back coal retirements or the very active debate around either one of those decisions. Tell me a little bit more about this finding.
Yeah, so I looked at a lot of these came from EIA data, which is, it's great that we have these authoritative sources that are tracking by the power plant, what was open where and when and with what power sources. And yeah, one of the large kind of alignments of energy and politics that you might expect to see is that, coal plants are kind of held on to more strongly in red states. And we saw in however many of the recent elections we're hearing beautiful clean coal, and we're going to save coal and all of that. So the notion would be, all right, well, especially in those red leaning states, we're going to see coal persevere. And the data shows that, yeah, a majority of the coal plants that have been closed in the past handful of years have come from those red states. And you can look at it two ways. One is, well, perhaps those red states, and it is true that those red states built more coal initially, so there's more to close, and maybe they clung to them a little bit longer, whereas some of the more blue leaning states perhaps closed them earlier to switch to gas or whatever might take its place. So it's still fair to say that there might be a partisan lens there, but what it highlights is that even in areas where there might be kind of an identity with coal, West Virginia is coal country, Appalachia, it's kind of entrenched in the culture. But even with that, it doesn't reverse some of the economics that might make it hard to keep a coal plant open. And this wider landscape shift is taking place even in those areas. So it's showing that what you assume by the politics alone isn't enough to say we know what the outcomes will be. And then for the utility leaders, I think what a lot of these conclusions come to, we'll probably talk about this more than once, but the utility leaders aren't politicians. What you're assuming about a state comes from the demographics, the electorate, and then how those are reflected in their elected leaders. By and large, the utility leaders are not the same. They are trying to keep the grid running. They're trying to keep it affordable. So even if it goes against what the historical record has been, coal has always been there for us, well, does it make sense anymore? And their responsibility is to answer that question with the data, with the facts that we're trying to look at here. So they're looking at what makes sense for their fleet long term, as well as in those places that really lean into coal. You're looking at the workforce. Does a shift away from coal do we need to think about coal miners and coal plant workers and how we can make sure those economies and those families are still supported during that transition? So it's kind of a different lens that they take than I think the politicians.
Not for the first time on this show, I will say, you know what happens when you assume. And I think that that is often the danger that we are in when we're talking about some of the bigger picture, longer term kind of strategic planning and decision making that utility leaders, like the many utility leaders listening to this episode right now, are making. We occupy an industry that has to think in terms of decades, not just in terms of political
Yeah.
cycles. So when we have the reality that, as you mentioned in the piece, quote unquote red Florida has 31% registered Democrats, blue states are drilling for oil. Do you think that there is, a risk for utility leaders and importantly also for regulators, policymakers who might be making some of those longer term strategic bets with, the idea of a political reality that might not actually reflect what their constituents, what their base thinks, wants, hopes for, et cetera? Tell me a little bit more about that dynamic, that paradigm between understanding political realities, understanding the actual realities of the base for utility customers and for constituents, and then factoring that into some of the longer term decision making that utility leaders and regulators have to make on a daily, quarterly basis.
Again, it's the utility industry. Those aren't the leaders that are getting perhaps blinded by the partisan glasses, like the politicians, by their nature, almost have to. And the figures you cite kind of highlight how a lot more of these states, I think we could call them more purple than they are red and blue when you really look at it, and they're more divided. When we think of a red state or a blue state, you're painting it with one brush, but I mean everything we're talking about political maps being redrawn in the news these days, highlighting well each of these states that's having their maps redrawn is because there's strong support of both parties in the states, and we're talking maybe a is a red state 55%, 57% Republican? And like how much does that, does that really how much should that paint the whole thing? So, again, I think utilities and their leaders, they do have to contend with public sentiment. They have to deal with the politicians who are more partisan, and they have to those politicians control things like funding or permitting decisions. But in the end, those utility leaders, they're driven by those nonpartisan or bipartisan core principles of we want the energy to be affordable, we want the grid to stay on, and I'll even say that we want the grid to be environmentally friendly. I think that's still a bipartisan ideal, and that's where you see the crux is that when we too quickly paint a state with a single color, you're taking a shortcut, and the utility leaders, they can't, and I think largely they don't. And you said it right that these are decades long decisions. They're decisions that are going to outlast any political trend. They're the if even if you look at what we consider a red versus a blue state now versus 2 or 3 decades ago when some of these plants were being built or proposed, it looked very different. And I think that probably also answers a lot of the questions of why some of the energy mix might not look like you would expect it to. It's because these are decades, even half a century long decisions when you're talking about nuclear.
It's an important point to illustrate specifically within, this industry. We have spoken on this show before about the difficulty of trying to, let's say, acquiesce in some ways to the whims of a certain political administration that's only going to be in office for maximum 8 years. The timelines that we're looking at in the utility industry stretch far beyond 8 years typically. Even the shortest ones, right? We're talking about 3 years, working 3 years ahead often. It I think is a good point to be made here that perhaps in our industry more than even most, it is very, very important for those in the decision maker seat to think about how they might be wrong, to think about how they can question assumptions, to think about how, the long term really matters more than the short term. And I do think that we have a lot of leaders in this industry who are thinking that way, to their credit. This idea of debunking, I think a lot of these myths might fall on more receptive ears and energy than it would in other industries. But these things have long tails, and I think we're only going to continue to kind of understand how all of that impacts, the world around us, the energy industry around us. We saw it with the endangerment finding rollback that we talked about with our editor Molly not too long ago, that we're looking at, a lot of these decisions being made now that are going to still unravel for years to come at the same time as utility, strategic plans are unraveling as well. So it's all like the timing of all of this, I think is very important. But also just the caveat with everything that we talk about on this show on energycentral.com in our newsletters, that it doesn't necessarily have to be rooted in the political assumptions that we all make. The one thing we can all agree on is that we want a reliable, affordable, and I agree, I would add clean in there as well, clean grid of the future. And how we get there is less about politics than it is about, I think, hopefully the laws of physics, laws of economics, and the directions in which those two and their cohort might point us.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with that. It's, we're having, and again, we're having these conversations not only online but in conferences, at keynotes, and you can definitely see year to year different ideas pop up and gain momentum and move. But again, I think, just like you said, for people in the power sector, whether they're engineers or economists or business folks, that again, they're those are all sorts of roles and backgrounds that should, and I think largely are, dictated by the facts. And show me the numbers, show me what's possible. Do those numbers shift as we learn more, as technology improves? Absolutely. That's a good thing. We want to see that progress, and to your point, we want to be open and ready to change our minds when new facts come to light, new technology changes the conventional knowledge. Those are all things that we want to be quick to adapt to. And the utility sector is a hard one, because we always say it's one of the slowest moving, and for most of its history, that's been right. And that makes it hard to mesh with the politics that are very, you know moving with the political winds. But I think, the modern utility sector, as it's getting more distributed, more intelligent, more online, it's, there's an interesting, I think, and I think positive mix of that. Let's be cautious, let's be slow to move, because we want to make sure what we're doing is correct. But kind of the fresh blood in the utility sector is open to all of these new technologies and the new ideas that come with them.
Yeah. I think it has been one of the great kind of realizations of my time in energy is that this industry is so deeply analytical. I appreciate that so much because I do think that it makes us all smarter and more informed. So when I get to speak with people on the show for, the many other things that we do at Energy Central and hear about just how many factors go into the decisions that they're making about these long-term strategies, it gives me a lot of hope, which is not something everybody in every industry can say. I think there's also one other point that I want to get your perspective on that feels often like perhaps the beacon of light in our industry, the reason for hope, the one bipartisan thing, as a lot of people have put it, and that is, of course, nuclear. We have joked on this show that it's the one thing people can agree on. You found that adoption is kind of all over the map politically. Kind of describe that as like a bipartisan win. Tell me a little bit more about what that means as we're kind of framing this within the context of debunking some of the assumptions that we make about politics and energy and where the two overlap. How does nuclear factor into that conversation, importantly as well, factor into the long term decision making that we're talking about utility leaders making right now?
Nuclear really highlights the, like you said, that long term nature. Most of the nuclear plants that are on the grid, and in the piece I highlighted that it's pretty well distributed between red and blue and purple states. Most of those plants have been on the grid for many decades. In the past 10 years, there have been two plants, I think, that have opened, or two reactors. So it kind of again highlights that we talk a lot about nuclear, but it's a very slow to move one, both in terms of coming online, but then they stay online. And I think it highlights that, nuclear is this long-term win. It's, the regions that have them, they tend to be happy with it. It's providing the baseload power, doing so in a carbon-free way. And in those places where the plants have been on for 30, 40, 50 years, the heavy cost of nuclear energy is building that plant. Once it's built and paid off, the fuel is cheap, the energy is cheap. So that's what makes it a win in the end, is that you're kind of satisfying the three legs of the stool of being affordable and clean and reliable. Where we might see some evolution in the discussion is, like I said, there hasn't been a lot of nuclear built recently. A lot of conversation now is about getting small modular reactors commercialized and out there. But you know, I think it might highlight how existing plants and the politics behind those and building new nuclear, those are going to be a little bit different because you still do have pockets of areas that are hesitant about nuclear. They're still worried about nuclear waste or the safety of it all. And I think the general sentiment has risen and been more pro nuclear on both sides of the aisle, and that's a trend that's been happening for a number of years. So that's a win. I think as we get closer to SMR commercialization, those debates are going to pop up, and there's going to be some fears and debates, and those are good things. We don't want to steamroll public concerns and just say trust us, it's fine. You want to engage with them and make sure everybody's happy with it. But again, I think it will be one of the keys that unlocks kind of the political bipartisanship where everyone's going to be happy in the end that we're getting some reliable, dispatchable, and carbon free power.
And let that be a reminder for people, and when the next great political debate emerges, I hope that we can come back to how we feel right now about nuclear and about the promise that it might have for our industry. So, Matt, I don't want to go through all 7 of these myths. People should read the article themselves to get a full picture of all of the many findings that you included in this great piece. Before I let you go, just out of curiosity, we chatted a bit about some of the main inspiration behind this, what you wanted people to get out of it, what kind of the main thesis point was. Did people take well to that? What was the response from the community as you published this piece debunking some of our political assumptions?
I'd say the response reflected a lot of the normal comments that I would expect in any piece. A lot of people saying, "Oh, I agree with that, and that makes sense," and engaging with it. And then here and there, some people who would just kind of brush it off and say, "But no, that doesn't align with my political understanding." And the beauty is that they're allowed to do that, and people are allowed to have those debates. And what maybe one of the big takeaways where in my role as community manager, where I'm engaging in these online comments and debates, and what gives me solace is that we're not necessarily the people who are having these shorthanded comebacks aren't the CEOs. They're not necessarily decision makers. Like we said, I think those leaders in the industry don't need the reminder that I'm putting out in this piece, and they're the ones that are probably more likely inspiring these kind of being fluid and being adaptable, and so hopefully that attitude permeates down. But yeah, I don't know that I changed any minds per se, but I'll say that I at least have something to link to when, like I said, when I want to be a little bit cheeky and say like, oh, are you sure about that?
Yeah. Are you sure about that is right. And now we have something to point people to, which I think is just a wonderful addition to the collection of content that you have helped us make here at Energy Central. So, Matt, thank you so much for stopping by the show as a guest, not just as our producer, and sharing a little bit more about what it took to build this piece, what you learned, some of the myths that needed debunking, and how the utility industry can learn from it. Again, really highly encourage everybody to go read it. It is really a wonderful piece that Matt put together. We will put it in the show notes. But thank you so much, Matt. I appreciate it.
Of course. Thanks for walking us through it.
Of course. And thank you to all of you once again for listening to this episode of Power Perspectives. I'm Kinsey Grant Baker, and I will see you next time.